Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Duke Football Coverage Podcast, brought to you, as always, by Bull City Coordinators. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and check us out at our website, www.bullcitycoordinators.com. Follow us on Twitter at DukeFBCoverage. Our DMs are open. You know how to get in touch with us. Our next guest is currently he is currently working as a defensive analyst at East Carolina. Hoist the colors, go Pirates. Throughout his career, he has worked with a number of great programs. He was with the Pittsburgh Steelers, shout out Lee Rodeo, South Carolina Gamecocks, at Indiana, which we will definitely talk about that as we get into this podcast, because he may have some intel for us on what to expect for the Blue Devils offense this season. He also coached at Florida and, of course, Duke University, where he studied history, graduated in 2013, before going on to obtain a master's from USC, which, if you're from the South, the only USC is in Columbia, South Carolina. He earned that master's degree in 2018. How are you, Matthew Symmes?
I'm doing well. I appreciate you having me on to talk a little ball.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, for those of you out there who follow the site and follow me on Twitter, you know I was very interested when Coach Houston's name came up as a possible candidate to replace David Cutcliffe at Duke. And because we have you on and you're at ECU, I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about what the atmosphere in Greenville is like right now and what we can expect from you guys this upcoming season.
Obviously it's June, so everybody loves us. We haven't lost this year, that sort of thing. Same process that everybody goes through. A lot of hope in the air right now. One thing that we bring back a lot of experienced football players, and everyone's experienced in the age of COVID with all the extra eligibility that's gone around. But we were a young football team pre-COVID before I got here. Those guys have played a lot of snaps now. So we're experienced, we're older. We're older in the places where it's really good to be older. Obviously, you want to be old everywhere, but it counts for more at quarterback. Along the lines of scrimmage. And then, in places where there's wear and tear with running, we've got guys who have learned how to take care of their bodies and how to get ready for a college football season, things like that.
Well, I have a rule as somebody who grew up in South Carolina and spent a number of years in the Low Country, living in Charleston and going to school at CFC. I have a rule that if you're a football coach and you can win at the Citadel, you are good at what you do. And Coach Houston, he did that. He had them ranked. He was, 14-11, 9-5 in conference in his 2 years there. Tell us a little bit about him and what he has brought into ECU.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing with him that I've learned to really appreciate, and something that I'll take with me, whenever I move on from here, as coaches always do. He is intensely competitive in all aspects of what we do without losing positivity, which I think is a hard thing. It's a hard line to walk. This is obviously an industry where criticism is a constant part of it, whether it's outside moving in or even if it's intended to be constructive when you're coaching players and things like that. Especially in the early part. And again, this was before I got here. They went through some challenges in terms of winning and losing. But the ability to find positives in tough practices, in tough games, when the outcomes aren't that you want, to keep people's hope going. Like, kids need hope, and we find, there's always something positive to talk about. And with that too, there's positivity, but it's competitive. And the other part about it that I was really impressed by when I got here and continue to think is one of the things that we do really well is we are a physical practicing football team. And I think everybody says that. I don't think you would ever question that if you came to one of our practices. And I think it makes a big difference for us. Like, our kids know how to hit. They like to hit. It's an attitude about what we do. And I think those are the things that for us, those are the cultural imprints of having Mike Houston at ECU. And so I think those are going to be what carry us forward, hopefully in the fall.
I want to ask you a little bit about constructive criticism for players, because when the big cat Kobe Cofield was on last season, we talked a lot about communication and how you can try to communicate in a positive way with young players. Can you talk a little bit about that, about kind of what the approach is where you're trying to get the do this differently or maybe do it a little bit better without breaking the kid down too much?
Yeah, I think it always comes from you got to know who you are, right? And I obviously Kobe was a really good player for us when we were at Duke, and getting Kobe to East Carolina was a good thing and something I'm really happy about. Kobe played 5 years of professional football, and so when he says certain things to get some buy-in from somebody, that comes across a little bit differently than somebody like me who played 0 years of college football. And obviously, I've been a lot of places and worn some cool shirts, and so there's certain kids who care about that stuff. But I have to be really intentional about developing relationships with players, and everybody should be doing that anyway. But if I don't have a good foundation with a kid, it can be very difficult for them to be like, all right, what do you really know about making a tackle on a B gap there, buddy? And so that I think is the biggest thing with it all. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about being here longer than just a year, some of my stops, I've only been places for a year, as you get to that second season where you're with guys and how you can communicate to them. Like there's one guy in particular I'm thinking of, which I would never raise my voice to the guy because I don't have to. I ask him to do things a different way and it is done. Whereas, there are other guys where you have to be unyielding and repetitive and with the instructions that you give. And that's the only way to get them to toe the line. And it doesn't make them bad people at all. But that's just the way that you handle them in that place. And I wouldn't know those without experience and at least having a relationship with them enough to where where the line is and how hard you can push a kid. But it is also good when you can just sit there and look a kid in the eye and be like, hey man, need you to be more physical there, go make that tackle. It's like, all right, yes sir, I got it.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you were saying is I've noticed this too. Everybody responds differently to different types of communication. And I don't think it's necessarily that they're misbehaving or they're not listening. It's just they don't snap into focus sometimes until they hear a raised voice, and then They know it's serious. But at the same time, I feel terrible today. I felt bad because I lost my patience with my son yesterday, but I'd had one of those, I'm trying to tell you, you need to do this and why you need to do it. And then there's a bit of a mouth back after a bit and, we snap. But as I was talking to him about it later, I said, son, sometimes it seems like you don't really respond until I up the volume of my voice, and so I need to work with you on not raising my voice like that. But at the same time, you also need to work on when I'm trying to talk to you, you need to listen. Right.
Yeah. I'll give you a good Duke centric story because I'll never forget it. So this was 2012. And I was the special teams, I guess QC. I was a student. I was a senior in college and I was helping Coach Middleton with special teams. And as a young coach, you're trying to find your footing with these things. These are guys that you see in class. There's really no barrier on the coach-player relationship. And something went wrong with one of the special teams. And I yelled at Max McCaffrey about something. And Max is like the most conscientious, just thorough in everything that he did, never took a play off ever, whatever. And I could see his face like visibly change. Like, what did you want me to do different? And it made me realize like, okay, all right, this is not a one size fits all way of doing this. And just, I had no perspective on that at the time. But that was, I distinctly remember that at the first moment in my coaching career, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to learn this. I'm going to have to learn this part as much as I learn anything else, just because I lacked the experience with, these highly competitive, highly talented people. You didn't get that playing small private school ball in Houston.
Well, did McCaffrey break a clipboard over his leg and toss it into the crowd, or did he handle it all right?
I will say this: he handled it pretty well. He handled it pretty well.
Well, tell us a little bit about your current role. Tell us a little bit. I like to have people who are in coaching educate the audience a little bit more about what everybody does. So just tell us a little bit about what you do currently.
So when I was let go in Pittsburgh, as happens to all coaches, I was trying to get back to college ball to begin with, and was looking for a place to go. And I'd worked off the field in the NCAA sense of the world, in preparing quarterbacks and helping with game planning and breakdowns on offense a lot. And I'd done that for, I guess, about 10 years. Had more responsibility in some places and less in others. And obviously, as I got older, I had the opportunity to do more things. When I left Pittsburgh, it was one of those things where I was trying to figure out, all right, hey, what do I really want to do next? And I've kind of felt like my last year in Pittsburgh, I grew less than I had in other years. Now, part of it is we were constrained by the NFL's rules of COVID and how much we could meet on things and what we could do. And so, not that it was anybody's fault, it was a different year. And I had the opportunity to go some different places and do some things, and even reunite with some guys that I'd worked with in the past that I knew I liked, and just felt like I really wanted the opportunity to work on the other side of the ball and see, what do college defenses really do when they look at, a game planning process. What are the things that, as an offensive football coach, that I need to be aware of, and how we construct things schematically, the visuals that we present, how are tendencies organized, what are answers to different calls. Now, it comes with the caveat that for the majority of my career as an offensive coach, I'd worked with single high defensive coaches. So I worked with on Coach Muschamp's staff at Florida and South Carolina for 3 years, and being descended from a Saban tree. I think Saban's famous quote is, "There's nothing in this world that cover three hadn't seen and been able to fix," or something to that effect. So they started as a post high defense there. And in Pittsburgh, obviously, between cover three and fire zones, that is a post high world. And so I understood some of the things that one high defenses tried to do, and the answers they had to have in an RPO centric 2022 offensive world. But to have an understanding of how quarters teams approach problems, 4 down versus 3 down front. And I knew, with the help of talking to Matt Guerrieri, who had worked for Coach Houston way back in the day, that those would be some of the things that I'd be exposed to. And so in that way, it was a little bit of a selfish decision on my part that, hey, I really want to go in a different direction with what I know. And for them, I think, for the rest of the staff, my main role is doing basically what amounts to opposition research, and providing an offensive perspective to what we see on tape, what is intentional, what's a mistake, what constitutes a tendency, and then make sure that the scout team is organized to reflect what a real offense would look like. Let's make sure we're blocking the runs correctly. Let's make sure that we're getting the protection turned the way that they think it's going to. Let's coach the routes the way that they need to be coached. And that's, I think, those two things are what, I think that's why I was hired. And I hope that I do a good job of that on a daily basis. But that's kind of the mesh of those things, kind of what I was looking for in this job and what they're looking to get out of me.
So are you trying to figure out the other team's offensive tendencies or their defensive tendencies?
Offense. So I work to help get our defense ready. And so that's been a really interesting thing going through the whole process. But I basically work like 4 to 5 days ahead. So like on a Wednesday of a game week, as we kind of get a plan wrapped up, like, we play ODU week 2 this year. By about Wednesday or Thursday, I'll be working on some of the things that we'll do for Campbell, getting a depth chart organized, personnel reports, and what are the things that they do well, what are the things we're going to have potential issues with, where can we target them, where their weakness is, and trying to have that information available to the coaching staff a little bit earlier in the week.
I think the old term was psyops, psychological operations, as they said in the military, trying to put in the propaganda and all that. So you're getting out in front to figure out all that stuff before everybody else looks at it.
It's definitely very not a lot of brain power going on, not a lot of psychology. It is, so a lot of it is just tape study, and we have data inputs that we use too that kind of help guide me. But I'm very much an old school, chart stuff on a pen and paper, and hey, this is kind of how I see them, and this is what I think of this player and whatever. And there are things that I've been wrong about, like just straight up wrong. And there are some things I think, okay, I probably helped us with some of that stuff. But it's been a really good experience for me because I get to be a part of all the conversations where the defensive staff is discussing how to solve a problem. And I do not have the macro view on that or the experience with, well, we tried this in 2017 and that didn't work, so we can't do that. But to hear them talk through how they solve an issue and how they feel the best way to address the wildly variant schemes that you get in college football on a week-to-week basis is really helpful for me, and knowing that I'll probably end up working on offense again. How are they going to approach this? How can I classify defenses more coherently for the coaching staff, for the offensive players that I'll work with? So it's a little bit of a forward-thinking job in that sense.
So are you breaking it down to individual players and their tendencies, or are you looking at overall coaching plans and how they approach things, or is it both of them?
Both. So like last year we played a team where on the video the week before we played them, we had the ability to tell run or pass based off the stance of a guard, and was able to find that. And we didn't win, but it was one of those things where early on I was like, oh, okay, I can help with this. And then, but from a schematic standpoint too, like, hey, these things tie in together for them philosophically. This is how they approach stuff. These are the things that I do that I think they're going to come to against our defense. These things give us problems, and it gave us problems 6 weeks ago. And maybe it doesn't show up on their breakdown, but if they do any homework at all, we're probably going to see that again, and we need to be at least prepared for it. And sometimes it's mostly you're not really the boy who cried wolf, but you're going to present more potential issues to the staff than we have time in a week to solve. And it's just helping make them aware of, hey, these are some of the things that I see as potential issues. Now, the flip side of it is I don't always have the perspective of somebody who say has been coaching safeties or corners or linebackers for 10 years. And they go like, all right, hey, this is what I actually see the problem as. They're like, okay. So there's always that part of it, but just try to make them aware of as many things as I can, and give them as much time as possible to try to solve some problems.
My first thought when you talked about things that we couldn't do 6 weeks ago that could cause problems, or wheel routes, which I think every Blue Devil fan, if they see another one that the other team is able to successfully score on, will just bury their heads in the sand forever, but we won't get into that. Speaking of Blue Devils a little bit, you kind of are building Duke East in Greenville. How is Tacoby doing, and how is Coach Boyette doing?
They're doing really well. I think we added Tacoby in July of last year to be a defensive GA. So he's actually working with me on defense, which at that point in the year is really just coaching the scout team O-line. When I say just, but that's a big part of that role that time. So having an O-lineman to coach the scout team O-line was huge, I think, for our players. Developing some of those scout team guys. But it was also a huge help for me I knew I could hand them a stack of run cards and they were going to be drawn pretty much right, which, that just makes our whole process more efficient. But, the value of having a guy from Tarboro on staff at East Carolina, I think is significant. Having somebody with a professional athletic pedigree on our coaching staff for our players, I think is really good. He comes from the John Latina School of Offensive Line Play, which means that that his standards of toughness and physicality are non-negotiable. And that really aligns with what Coach Houston is trying to do. And so I'm super grateful that he's here. it was kind of nice to walking into a place where I'd never worked with anyone before. All of a sudden we get to fall camp and there's a guy there that I know, which was pretty neat. And obviously he's now over on offense, working with the offensive line, which, that's going to be his wheelhouse. But, he's a great addition to this place for a lot of reasons. I think the geographic ties, especially when it comes to recruiting, can't be overstated. Knows a lot of people around here, trains some kids, but the fundamental development things that he can do as a guy who's played the position and gone from someone who was a redshirted player to somebody who, did it on the biggest stage possible. I think that helps. And then obviously having Ray here is pretty cool. Ray was the GA at Duke in 2012, and we signaled together. He got promoted to running backs coach in 2013, and I got to take his GA spot. And in that time, I moved all over the United States, and Ray just drove 90 minutes down the road. But Ray is great. Obviously it's fun because I really didn't talk a ton of football with him from 2013 until now, just to see, the guy's now coached 2 positions, just the remarkable command he has of offense and the ability to consistently get productivity out of his players. We saw that at Duke, and I know it's going to be the case here, just a high standard for effort and detail work that he has. But I've always, Ray and I, when we would catch up, it was always just, we weren't talking about football at all for 9 years. Just how's things going there? Have you enjoyed it? How's your family doing? I see, he's got 2 kids now, and that process along the way. And now all of a sudden there's a little more football involved, but it's really nice to have both those guys there. And I think not that it's any different anywhere else. When you go back a long way with people, there's just some inherent trust that exists. And, I know when those guys say something, or they have an opinion on something, that where it comes from and who they are as men. And that I enjoy working with people like that.
Well, that's good to hear about both of them. It was hard to lose Coach Boyette. I was hoping he would have stayed on staff, but and you can speak to this, and I'll ask you about it in a minute. And whenever there's a staff change, that usually bodes ill for the current people there. One thing I did want to mention, of course, Coach Houston has a Fred Goldsmith connection. For those of you who want to go way, way back to the 90s Blue Devils teams, Coach Goldsmith started coaching at Lenoir-Rhyne. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but I'm from South Carolina. I get a pass. And of course, Coach Houston succeeded Goldsmith there when he finally retired from football. But let me ask you a little bit about this, because you mentioned it some, being with the Steelers, and I've talked to other coaches about this, Coach Latina, about what it's like when you come in one day and said, thanks for everything you've done, but we're going in a different direction. You've got a family. What is that process like? How do you guys deal with that?
So when I got let go in Pittsburgh, that was the first time that I'd been let go when my wife and I were living together. And the 2 other times that I've been let go, really 1.5, but we were living apart. We were still dating. And so it was like I just had to pack up my apartment and go somewhere else. Doesn't really affect anybody else. But when it is your family, the first thing you get off the phone, you're like, all right, I've been let go. That's part of it. It's a possibility when you don't have the year that you want to have, or you don't achieve the standards that exist within an organization. And you pick up the phone, you start making phone calls. And my wife was at work, so I had to call her and be like, hey, we got fired. I'll kind of let you know when you come home from work what progress I made. I call my parents so that they know, because sometimes staff changes make it out on the internet faster than you can relay them to people. Typically with people at my level, where we've been, not as much, but like for example, at South Carolina, it came out probably a little sooner than I wanted to, that I probably wasn't going to be around moving forward, and just wanted to get ahead of it a little bit. And I called my wife's mom, tell her the same thing. And then after that, it is, for the people that I know who will move heaven and earth for me, You're calling them over the next hour. If you don't get a hold of them, you're shooting a text to try to say, hey, hit me back. For the people that you've worked with, that you're not going to work with again for maybe ever, and then the guys that, hey, appreciate the time with you, should give them a call, ask them to call you. They may not know. And especially, last year, it was 15 months ago, 16 months ago, nobody's in the office. And when you were in the office, you couldn't be in the same room with other people. So not seeing somebody for a while wasn't an uncommon thing. And then the last thing you do, there are people in my phone book that I'm not particularly super close with, but who I know will help me or have a certain positive professional opinion of me. And you draft a text message, with a, hey, I've been let go. Here are the things that I can do. If you have anything or of anybody, whatever. And sometimes, I would say usually that doesn't pan out with that stuff, but you never know. Like, I've gotten texts from guys before, like, hey, I'm being let go. And you're like, oh, okay, well, we actually have a job opening here. Is that something you'd be interested in? They're like, well, that's not really exactly it, but I appreciate you keeping me in mind. So you never know if one of those lands. But it's just a race. And I think the toughest part about it is you make all those calls, and that first day you're just scrambling, and then you just have to sit there and wait for people to get back to you. So, I just kind of sat on the couch and watched some TV and read some books. It's nothing to do. Wait till your phone rings.
Yeah. And you've been at some tough places too. I mean, Indiana, and we'll talk about that later, not really known for football success. South Carolina, other than those, the time Spurrier was there when he had those 3 or 4 really, really good years, a tough place. But I want to ask about some of the coaches that you've worked with. I mean, you were in the Steelers organization. That's a historic one that is thought of as well run and well operated. And you were coaching with Mike Tomlin. What could you tell us about him? And this is more a question Lee Rodeo probably wants me to ask a little bit. So I got to do that.
I thought, well, hey, I don't know if there is a more formidable leader of men than that guy. You think about all the challenges that come with managing the personalities, egos, motivations of a professional locker room, where there is, significant financial incentive at stake, and you've got highly competitive people beyond that. There's some people, their money's important to them. Some people just want to win, and you've got 50 plus people that you got to keep happy, and you got to keep them all on the same page. You got to keep pulling in the same direction. And he is a master of that. And just he defined it as charismatic leadership. And he has that. And I don't think it's just so authentic that I'm not sure you can really replicate it beyond just a couple of people. And that you're just seeing that and being around that is remarkable. And so you can't really take that with you, because that's just kind of who he is. It doesn't really have anything to do with what's taught, but to be around that on a consistent basis, and the things that took place from 2018 to when I left with, we had an unbelievable year offensively in 2018 that culminated in what happened with Antonio. The next year, Ben gets hurt. The year after that, COVID. Like, there was always a major hiccup that we had to work through. And he was just really good about it. And he talks about distinguishing traits with players. His distinguishing trait as a coach is his charismatic leadership. But what makes him so easy to work for, and what makes him so easy for the players to work with, is he's the same every day. It doesn't matter if we beat the Patriots on Sunday afternoon to keep our playoff hopes alive, or we lost to the Bengals on Monday Night Football, postponed us winning the divisional week and knocked us down a spot in the playoffs. He's the same guy every day at work. And there is something very comforting in not having to guess what the head coach is, whether he's approachable that day, all those different things. And I just, like, those were things that were really, really good about working with him. And he's got kind of a unique football background too, because he played wide out and was and then coached DBs. And so he's got this really global perspective on football and what teams are trying to do or whatever. And I think it's helpful and it's kind of one of those things that made me interested in working on defense in college. If I didn't have maybe the best offensive option materialize for me when I got let go, was he was able to incisively get some things that we might have taken a little longer to find as an offensive staff. And so I just think, those things are really neat. Actually, I don't know if you heard on your end when my laptop went off and dinged. That was him texting me back from something I texted him about yesterday. So it just, a good guy, and I obviously learned a lot working for him.
We also worked with what, by all appearances, looks like another very, very good offensive coaching mind, and someone who will hopefully have the Blue Devils on the offensive side of the ball running well and operating well. Was Kevin Johns. You were on staff with him in Indiana in 2015. We don't need to bring up the Pinstripe Bowl, but
we can have that argument later. The field goal was good.
Well, I'll get Carlos on right now. He's going to have something else to say about that. But anyway, tell us a little bit about Coach Johns. And before you get into that, I will say, though, and because you probably haven't listened to this because you got better things to do with your time, but I did a 2-hour long almost special about all 4 of the bowl games last year with Carlos Ray.
Okay.
And I went back and watched. They didn't have the full Pinstripe Bowl on, but I watched. I watched almost all of it twice. I didn't realize that was a backup running back you guys had.
Oh yeah.
Coming into that game, you guys were running the ball really well. So I'm excited for this upcoming season. But what can you tell us about what we should expect from Coach Johns?
So I ended up at IU. I've been let go at Florida, and I had to move back in with my parents because my lease in my apartment ran out, and try to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? And my father-in-law put me in touch with the defensive GA who got my resume in front of KJ. And I think what ended up happening, I've never directly asked him this, but I feel reasonably confident in it, is the guys that they wanted to hire couldn't get into school. And as a Duke grad, I was going to be able to get into graduate school. And so I got up there, and literally like within a week they had me. I remember like they were trying to find somebody who they didn't have a full-time quarterbacks coach on staff. KJ did quarterbacks and wideouts. So I should say they did not have an individual spot for both of them. Obviously KJ is a full-time guy coaching them, but they were trying to find somebody who had a quarterback background to help take some of the work off at younger wideouts and a really older, mature seasoned quarterback in Nate Sudfeld. And so let KJ have some time in the spring to work with wideouts, and I can take the quarterbacks, whatever. So I get up there and literally I don't know the offense. I can barely find my way around the building, and I'm running quarterback meetings. And just KJ is a really, really good human being. He's a really good football coach too, but he is a really, really good person. And for him to have that kind of trust and, a lack of ego when it comes to those sorts of things is what really allowed me to flourish at IU. Working there, he let me have, I was getting older and knew a little bit more about coaching, but the biggest role I'd had up to that point in game planning and installation and in-game adjustments and things like that. And he empowered me to do that in a lot of ways. The football education that I got working for him and for Kevin Wilson is one of the best things that I've ever had. Those guys look at the game of football a little bit differently than I think a lot of people do. And KJ's background, when you think about the people that he's worked with, he worked for Kevin Wilson. He worked for Cliff Kingsbury at Texas Tech, and he worked for Mike Norvell at Memphis. And those are like 3 of the foremost offensive minds in really the last 25 years. And so his background and some of the stuff that he knows is I think, really good. And obviously we played Memphis this past year. And some of the RPO related things that they do are unique and stressful to the defense. And so I a ton of respect for him for the opportunity that he gave me. But I also, even after I left IU, we would touch base on, hey, what have you seen that's good? What did you like quarterback wise? What are some of the things you do? And so I really enjoyed, talking to him about that stuff through the year, but we've stayed in touch. He remains a good friend, so I'm excited to see offensively what he'll do there.
Well, not to take anything away from Cliff Kingsbury, but he does have a wide receiver who went to Daniel High School, lived in Central South Carolina. I'm just saying, us Central boys, we make everybody around us better. So just keep that in mind. Okay. Keep that in mind. So you've coached a lot of different spots and a lot of different parts of teams. Is that challenging? Is it helpful? With what you're doing now, does it make your job? It sounds a little bit like you're doing a mix of analytics geared with game plan designing, but has your background helped you with that in your current role?
Yeah. So I think it's, at least my story, understanding how I got to this point, important to go back. And at Duke, so I started working for Kurt Roper when I was there. And Kurt is the person who raised me up in this business, both in terms of understanding what it meant, like what the world of coaching was, and then in addition to that, football. And what was and remain, he's one of my biggest influences as a coach, but also just as a person in my life. And Kurt, the way that he taught quarterbacks and the way that he taught understanding of football began with understanding defenses. And so that's always been a significant part of how we approached problem solving. And at Duke, I didn't know anything about football. I knew the signals, and that was my job. And, that was kind of it. And at Florida, I learned a lot more just because I went there and I was the only GA that Kurt took. And so I had to do all the breakdowns. And, I learned a lot more about defensive football there. Certainly a different kind of system being around, being in the SEC, really good experience. But when it wasn't until I got back to South Carolina after doing my year in residence with KJ that I really, I think, started to have a fuller picture of what getting ready for a football week was like, and the ability to play a role in that at a meaningful and significant level. And that really all begins with the way that Kurt taught me. And so when I approach this role of how do I go through and study an opponent, it's really not as much analytics, like in the sense of like, well, they're going to do this in decision making. We do, look at percentages and tips and things like that, but it's rooted in the study of video. And that was how Kurt taught quarterbacks, and by osmosis, that is how I was taught, that you have to go look at tape. You have to study video. You have to take a look at what they're doing. It's not enough to just see numbers written on a wall. Like, so what if they run a lot of inside zone on 2nd and 4 to 6? How are they blocking different fronts? What are the things that get them out of it? And what are the issues that they have with it? Where are they weak in their combinations? And so getting to this point, I have been absolutely helped by working at all these different places, because I've been exposed to so many different ideas, so many different coaches, so much of the different ways of looking at the game of football, and how you take that. And now I can look at tape and say, all right, hey, those guys, I know that coach's background, I know who he's worked with, and I can see on his tape that this is how they're doing this. And these are some things that give that some issues. But to me, it all goes back to how I was raised up, and that started at Duke. And so it's been enormously beneficial. It's been honed by a lot of different things along the way. And I hope it helps here. But I do think that my career ultimately would have looked a little different if I'd stayed at Duke. But I don't think that I would be as well versed in football if I hadn't gone out and been forced to see some alternate opinions on things.
Well, we're going to get into Duke here in one second, but I did want to read something to you from Carlos. I texted him about your comment about the Pinstripe Bowl. And he does have a question that he wants me to ask you, though. He complimented your football acumen. He gave very high praise about you, but he did say this. He told me to use Miami as an example of why we didn't question anything with that win against Indiana. So,
I think that's a fair point. So that was our bye week at IU. And so my wife and I, or she was my girlfriend then, but we had this whole plan on Saturday, hang out, watch college football day, do some different things. And it was going to culminate in, we were going to go to our favorite restaurant in Bloomington. They had this unbelievably good fried okra. We're going to go pick it up. We're going to bring it back to the house. And we're going to watch the Duke Miami game together. And we get to the restaurant. There had been a fire. So the restaurant was closed. It had happened like that morning. So no good food. So we go and serve whatever. We miss a part of the game because trying to figure out, all right, where can we go to eat on a Saturday night in Bloomington on short notice to pick up food. We get back to the house. We watch the last play. And at that point, I think I literally just turned to TV off. I was like, I'm going to bed. I can't do this. And it just like, we'd had a really enjoyable weekend together. And it was just like, oh, that's a terrible capstone to all this. So fair point.
Yeah, that was pretty bad. I ended up talking about this on the last interview, and I had to drop an E rating for it. I'm not going to do that this time, but that was just abysmal. I mean, there were so many failures.
Yeah.
Having talked to so many guys who were on that team who were there, Coach Latino was one. I don't know how you can have a ref looking right at it and miss it. Okay, fine, that happens. But the multiple layers of replay to get it wrong, that's the real inexcusable part. And my last guest said something about it's hard not to think that he said, you are passionate as a Duke fan. There are not a lot of passionate Duke football fans out there compared to the number of passionate Miami fans. Sure. And he said it's hard not to be conspiratorial in your mindset based on that's part of what was going on. Like they'd rather have Duke fans upset than Miami fans.
Yeah. And I've always been a big believer in that, like, the last thing that may happen in a game is tied to referees. But that's very rarely the cause of why you win or lose with it all. Like I think back to that game, I think the first possession, Duke didn't punch the ball in and on a short field. And it was just one of the things, like I thought about that more that night than I did the last play. Cause lucky things happen. That's kind of the way it goes. Unlucky things happen. And sometimes they help you, sometimes they don't. But it's the controllable things that ultimately make the difference and whether you win it or not.
Of course, one could also ask why even have replay if you can't get something that obvious right, but you make a good point. So let's talk about your time in Durham. How did you end up at Duke?
So my mom went to Duke. So I was born and raised a Duke fan. Now it was more Duke basketball given the era that I grew up in. But I knew, so in high school, I was just a bad football player, but I loved the game. I had coaches who really encouraged me to be involved with it in different ways, even then. And it was something I was interested in being a part of. And I wasn't entirely sure in what capacity, but I knew that I wanted to know. And so I didn't want to go to school at a place where there were a lot of people working with the football program. And I would, it would be hard for me to get to the front of the line and find out whether it was something I really wanted to invest my time in. I also knew if it didn't work out, I wanted a good degree in case I wanted to go another direction. So, and the last piece of it was I wanted to go to a place that played Division I football. I didn't want to go to an FCS school to try to find this out. And so when Cut got hired, I guess it was in the middle of my junior year. Yeah, going in the fall of his first fall in Durham was the fall of my senior year. I knew about his quarterback pedigree. And I knew that, just from, and I didn't have anybody connected in the industry, but people had really nice things to say about him. And so when it came time to make a choice on where I want to go to school, that's what I did. And before I got to school, I emailed Kent McLeod, a person whose email I found on the website, to ask if I could work in the recruiting office. And Kent found a way to let me stuff envelopes for about 3 semesters. And after 3 semesters doing that, I was like, hey, would you mind going down to Coach Rover's office and asking if I can work with him. And he set up a meeting. He was like, yeah, he's in his office now. Go knock on the door. I was like, okay, great. And I'll never forget, Kurt looked up and he was like, you could almost see in his face, like, who are you and how did you get in here? But I asked him if I could follow, basically like shadow him this whole deal. And I didn't know what that would look like. And he was like, well, why don't you just become my equipment manager? He didn't have an equipment manager at that time. The guy had just graduated. He's like, you can sit in all my meetings. And that's how I got started. I literally just knocked on his door and asked, and he was like, yeah, okay. And I'm sure after that, he went down the hallway and asked Kent if, I actually did work in the recruiting office downstairs. But that was it. And I started my junior year. I basically just went to practice my junior year and I did all the signals. And at the end of my junior year over the summer, I flew back up to Durham for a camp. And I was teaching 8th grade English at like a summer deal and basically like just flown out at night, come in for a Saturday camp. And I waited till everybody had left. And I told Cut that I was going to be underloading first semester of my senior year. I was scheduled to graduate and I'd be available a lot more often in case there was a role that I could fill. And I was really just terrified that he was going to hire some people and I wasn't going to have a spot once I graduated. I didn't know anybody else. And knowing what I know about Cut now, he wouldn't have let that happen. But I wanted to make sure I got my foot in the door. So I go home, I come back, and I find out that I'm going to be assisting Coach Middleton with special teams in addition to helping Kurt as I guess, student assistant at that time. And that's how I got started. And they found a way to up the number of hours they could pay me in a week, which I have no idea how they did that. It's awesome. And I worked basically as a full-time coach my first semester of my senior year. I was probably a little bit more casual with my hours in the second semester, as I enjoyed being a second semester senior. But that was that process. And then sometime in the spring, I don't remember when, after I think they made the decision they were going to promote Ray to running backs, Kurt asked me if I'd be interested in being a GA. And I was like, yes, please. Please don't give that to anybody else. And that was it. I got to go from there. Kind of a fortunate thing, I suppose, more than anything else. But certainly it was the right decision.
You mentioned this. You said you were running the signals at one point. Tell us what that means and what that entails.
So on game day, the play caller is usually up in the press box, and on a headset he'll relay the call down to the field. And there are designated personnel responsible for relaying that with hand signals to the players. There are a lot of different ways to do it. It's one of the games within the game, at least in modern football. People try to steal signals, and how do you try to avoid that with all that stuff? But I started doing that for those guys in 2011. I actually signaled from 2011 through the end of the 2017 season at various different places.
Those are the guys holding up those big poster boards at some schools, holding all those up. I got you. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Cutcliffe era. You were there for the 2013 season, right?
I was. 11, 12, and 13 were the years that I was on the staff, or I should say on the staff. 11, 12, 13 were the years that they let me in the locker room.
Okay. Well, 2012 was a wonderful season for a number of reasons. Ended with some heartbreak, which we don't need to relive. But let's talk about the 2013 season. What was that like?
It was really interesting going through it as a young coach, because it wasn't until about 2/3 of the way through that it sort of dawned on me, like, holy crap, this is really cool. This is really unique. And it took, I think it was when we beat Miami, and all the fans stormed the field, that it was like, this might end up being the high watermark of my entire career. Like, it may not ever get any better than this. So let's just enjoy it. And I kind of thought we had a chance, and I had no context for anything, right? I was 22 and really had no understanding of what was taking place. But you kind of looked around and you went, okay, I could see how we might be good. And it was kind of the same thing that when I look at our ECU team now, that you see, like, we're old, we're veteran. Anthony had not played yet, but he'd been in the system. Well, I guess he started the year before against Virginia, and wrapped up the weight game, but he hadn't been a tenured starter, I guess, if that makes sense. So you looked at that, you looked at the number of starts that we had returning on our offensive line between, Perry, Dave, Matt, Lakin, and Jacoby. Like, I think we had like 100 plus returning starts that year. We had 4 really good running backs and, didn't have a way to distribute the ball to all of them at the same time, but we were deep at that position. We had the right body types to have depth for special teams. All those guys were big backs. We had depth at tight end with Deaver and DJ, and then at wide out, obviously Jameson the year before had caught 76 balls or something like that, and had a really good year. And when you kind of realize that, okay, this guy's taking it to another level, we were in a scrimmage in fall camp, and on 4th and 2 or 3 or something like that, kind of on the fringe of field goal range, we called a pass, and Knowles played press quarters, and Ross Cockrell was on Jameson, and Jameson beat him off the line of scrimmage and ran a post and caught it for a touchdown, and Anthony dropped the ball in. And we knew Ross was a good player, and it was one of those things where it was a really aggressive throw. It was a very trusting throw, and Jameson made a great play on it. And I think about that going, like, that was kind of the first inkling. You're like, well, okay, we might have some pieces here. Like, this is good. And of course, I had no idea at the time, like, what we were going to be. And even if you had told me, I'd have been like, okay, yeah, sure, I believe you, because I hadn't been around it enough at that point to know. But looking back, it makes sense how we were that way.
Well, and you mentioned it being a special year and it being a high watermark for a long suffering Duke football fan. It was, but there were a lot of signs building to that. The 2011 season, 3-9, but there were a number of close losses. You can listeners go to bullcitycoordinators.com, and I detail that and pretty extensively on the history of the Cutcliffe era. And then, of course, 2012, again, you get to a bowl game, and you're mentioning this now about you're seeing some signs, you're realizing there's some depth. What was it about that team that allowed them to go on the run that they went on and get all the way to the ACC championship and win the Coastal?
I think it's a lot of things. On offense, experience was, I think, the most important deal. Like, we were physically mature on the line of scrimmage and really physical. And because of that, we could hand the ball off and really, without wondering what was going to happen, knew that we'd be in a better down and distance the next time. We had a legitimate matchup problem for everybody that wasn't Florida State that year. And they, Jameson had some good plays against Florida State too, but for everybody else, they had to make serious choices about how they were going to handle Jameson. And I don't remember exactly at that time how prevalent people playing left and right receivers was, but we had gone away from playing a traditional X that went to the boundary a lot. And it made it the year before, and it made it a little bit more difficult to say, like, all right, hey, we're just going to cloud the boundary a bunch and try to take Jameson away. And I don't necessarily think that that's like some sort of really obvious component of it. But one of the things we did too, like, we ran a lot of tempo plays in 2013. I remember I did a study towards the end at South Carolina as we were kind of wrapping things up, and just like the number of one-word plays that we called that year, I think was like 10% of our calls. So we went fast. We got the ball in the perimeter to Jameson a lot. We found ways to move him around, just make people's lives miserable. But on offense, like, the experience of the collective staff time together, and B, the players who have grown up in the system gave you a chance to be consistently productive. And on defense, we were old on the D line, which helps. Getting Kelby back made a huge difference. Adding Jeremy Cash made a huge difference, right? You added 2 players, one from transfer, one from transfer injury, on the second level, who were experienced and good football players, and you got them back and you didn't have them here before. But the linchpin of the whole deal was the youth movement in the back end that was just insanely productive for a bunch of freshmen. Obviously everybody thinks about Devon, right, in the NC State game, but between Brian Fields and Breon Borders, you had two like really good corners who played early. I think Breon picked off Jameis twice in the 2013 ACC championship game. Brian was a really physical and technically good corner. And then the safeties in the back end between DeAndre and Devon and those guys, like we had good players and they were all good and they were all good really fast. And we picked off a ton of passes that year, created short fields, were able to erase some of the other challenges that come with being young in the secondary. But that's a credit to DJ and Matt and Coach Knowles with that stuff, getting those guys ready to go. And that I thought was what made us like championship level good, was how well those guys came on.
And you alluded to this earlier, one of the best offensive lines in Duke history. And well, that whole unit for the years they were together were very, very good. But you also had at wide receiver below Jamison, or I shouldn't say below Jamison, but in addition to Jamison, you had Isaac Blakeney and then Max McCaffrey. When I rewatched the Peach Bowl, he just kind of appears in the fourth quarter with the game on the line, and all these passes start going to him. And any casual observer and even a dedicated fan would think, why isn't Jamison getting the ball? But you had a guy like him just stepping right in and making plays.
And I think, Max was so reliable for the role that he was in, working on the other side of it, and like didn't get the volume of downfield target, like because every shot play that we called was going to go to Jamison, right? I mean, like find a way to dial it up and throw the ball to him down the field. I think at one point in his career, the 4 years he was in college, he had more 50-yard touchdowns than anybody else in college football. I might be making that up, but I'm pretty sure that's right. And Max was always going to get some different things with it, but you didn't ever have to wonder like, all right, A, he's definitely going to run the right route. B, he's going to be there, and C, he's going to catch it. And that was, if teams were going to work hard to take Jameson away, to know that, okay, Boone's going to have a good choice somewhere else was neat. And to that too, I don't mean to take anything away from those guys. Like when you realize there was a moment in the Navy game where you went, oh, okay, this is a little different, where Isaac caught a hitch that restarted down in the red zone and just outran everybody on Navy's team to the other corner and literally just ran away from them. And you went, we've never really had a guy who just could kind of catch it short and outrun. And they were a good team that year. And Brandon Braxton, the same way. Like he had a 75-yard touchdown catch against Pittsburgh where he just kind of caught the ball in an over route and just ran away from everybody. And like you had moments like that where you went like, that's a little unique for what, and again, I hadn't experienced a whole lot, but that's different than the last couple of teams that I'd seen here. Maybe this can go that way. But I don't know, like it kind of built. And then all of a sudden, I think everybody kind of knows the turning point was that Virginia Tech game, where I don't think it's possible for an offense to play any worse than we did that day. And, but we made enough plays. And at the end of the game, getting that first down, obviously, like when we had to run it, they knew we had to run it. We were able to run it, that's what a good team can do. But the defense, man, they stood up. They really stood up for like 2 weeks in a row. Because after that game, I think it was NC State after that. And
that's correct.
And obviously, like it took us a while to get it going. We hit that big post to Jameson on like the first or second play. And then after that, we didn't do anything for a while. And 2 games in a row, they had 4 takeaways. Obviously, everybody knows Devon went ham that game. But, they stood up for us in a big way, and we were finally able to help them out a little bit against Miami by being able to run the ball. But that Virginia Tech game was definitely the moment where you went, okay, like we went up there and we beat a really good team on the road and it was an afternoon game. It turned into night. Like, guys, we got a shot to be really good this year.
I refer to that game as offense is optional. That's my memory of it. And I remember Ross Cockrell stepping in front of, I can't remember who it was, but just the way he slid his body in front of the receiver to make that pick.
Yeah.
I mean, Duke had throughout my time as a fan up until that point, they'd had individual guys a lot of times. They had one or two good guys, but to the point that we're getting at right now, it was very rare that you had as many people on both sides of the field at the same time that Duke had that season.
Yeah. And I think that was, in hindsight, looking back at it, now you realize, okay, the reason that not that you players obviously make everything go, but we were really good. And I don't think we realized how many really good players we had. Like Ross is still playing in the NFL. He's won a Super Bowl. Obviously Lucas, still with the Packers. Matt Skura was in Baltimore when I was with Pittsburgh. Jacoby, Lakin, like we had a bunch of NFL players running around. I think Juwan Thompson won a Super Bowl with the Broncos. Jameson's on another contract. Like you sit there and you look at that and you're like, okay, like this makes a lot more sense in hindsight. And it wasn't just like we had captured, I say we, like I had a lot to do with it, but it wasn't as if everybody just caught lightning in a bottle. Those guys who had been there and working since '08 had recruited a bunch of really good football players and developed them. I think that's always going to be the secret ingredient. But at a place like Duke, where Jameson was maybe not the right size for some of the other schools around there, but he was plenty good enough for us. And that stuff like that, that's always going to be the way.
Well, and one thing too that Thomas Sirk said when we were talking after the interview was over was that team, that 2013 team, he said, we really didn't need the coaching staff because we held each other accountable so much. And I mentioned that to Coach Latina, and he said, when you have the players take ownership of the team, you're going to have a special year. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
It's interesting you say that, because one of the things that I remember the last practice I think that we had before the Peach Bowl, Cut got up in front of the team and he said, hey, I want to congratulate you guys. You guys went an entire year without having a bad practice. And I had, of course, no context. I was like, yeah, this is kind of how it always goes. Like you come out here, you work hard. And once I got to other places, that sometimes you did have practices where things weren't as crisp, where people weren't as focused. In that way, I do think Thomas is right. And I think after we played Miami and we were getting ready to play, it was at Wake the next week. Sunday practice comes around and we're gathering up as an offense around the deal. And Kurt is talking to the group and he was like, hey guys, we're going to do whatever, go out there this week, try to win one more football game. He goes, but you guys already know what we're going to do. We're going to run a little inside zone. We're going to run a little 6-man protection and we're going to roll the ball out there and we're going to see if they want it enough. And the kids all laughed, but it was true. I mean, it wasn't like it was really a secret, and we were going to hand the ball to those backs and they're going to have to get off blocks on the offensive line that the guys that we had were going to maul them a little bit. And Jameson was going to catch 8 to 10 passes and one of them was going to be a bomb. And you had to figure out how to hold up against all that. So to that point, to Thomas's point, like, yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to it. Now, I think the other part of it too is we did have some really good coaches on that staff. Latz is as well respected as anybody in the business. Obviously, Scotty didn't go from Duke to the Steelers and then back to Duke. And then, I think he's with the Colts now. For any other reason other, he's sharp and he got those guys to play well. And between, Ray brought a significant amount of energy to that room. Zach is as sharp schematically as you'll find. And then Kurt's ability to, he does a really nice job of generating input during the week and kind of focusing on where the game's going to be, and having it play out the way that he wants to on Saturday. But like, that was a really strong collection. And you think about like the other thing too, like Josh Brizard was our QC that year. And, he's still with the Dolphins. I think he's going in his like 7th year there. Jeff Ferris obviously ends up being the coordinator and then is now at UCLA. And our assistant offensive line coach was Marcus Johnson. I mean, we had like really, really good coaches on that staff. And I think that counts for something in it all. And obviously nothing is more important than good players. Nothing ever will top that. But those guys, I think, helped tremendously with it too.
Two additional topics, and then I want to give you an open mic. You mentioned this about the coaches, and Coach Latina mentioned this when he came on, or it may have been after the interview was over. He told me that he felt like at Duke, everybody in the room was on the same page. There were no coaches who were not working together, and that the room was, I don't want to say closed, but close knit.
Yeah.
And that he thought that really helped get the program to where it went to. Yeah. And then you mentioned this about the players. When I've had a lot of guys from that era come on, they have all said none of us were particularly highly ranked recruits, but we were all just football players.
Yeah.
And we went out and made plays. And I just wondered I wondered what your coaching perspective on that is, and if that kind of recruiting model is something that you all continue today at ECU.
I think from the coaching staff thing, Latz is 100% right. Like that was a really close group. And like to that point, whatever it was in 2019, I was at Matt Guerreri's wedding, sitting at a table with a bunch of Duke people, looking across the table at a bunch of Duke people, with a bunch of Duke people in the wedding party. And, when I traveled as a coach and I was not working at Duke, I was working other places. The place I always came back to was Duke because I knew I would be welcomed there, that I still had a lot of friends in that place. And when I lived in Pittsburgh and Coach Latch was up in Newcastle, the home of all the greatest things in the history of the world, I drive up there and have lunch with him. And because that's just what you do. And everybody was pulling in the same direction. And it's certainly other places you feel sometimes like other people have their own agendas and whatever. But I was so naive. That place was like Shangri-La in a lot of ways. That just like, we all just wanted to win. And we certainly wanted to grow. And it was easy to be, it was easy to fall in line with that mentality as a young coach. When you looked around, you saw it practiced everywhere. And I think to that point, like one of the reasons that I worked for Kurt in so many different places and continue to enjoy being around him is there was a time when I literally could do nothing to help that guy other than just hopefully signal the plays in right. And he treated me the same then as he does now. When, there are some things about football that sometimes we can talk about. And it just, that was a significant part of that place and is absolutely one of the reasons why we were successful. And then from a player standpoint, like, yeah, I don't think maybe didn't have a ton of like super highly rated players. I think Shaq Powell was like a pretty highly rated guy by the services, but didn't maybe have the offers that matched that. And so I think there's definitely some truth to it. I think basically every person involved in football, whether it is player or coach, kind of walks around with a chip on their shoulder. I've been passed over by this. I haven't gotten this opportunity. I deserve whatever. And then if they're competitive people, they work at it to try to prove other people wrong. And I think what was really unique about that group of guys is when they showed up at Duke, that all they knew was the work. And they knew the philosophy of the coaches and the culture that was there and the lack of ego in that place and the example set by Cut and those guys. It's like, hey guys, we're just going to work. Everything else is going to kind of fall where it does. And in the same sort of way that like as a young coach, you fall in the line with that. I think as a player, you're like, okay, this is just how we approach everything. We just work day by day, go through this process. And at the end of it, we kind of see where everything lands. What made those guys really special was they were like that all the time. It wasn't just when the coaches were around with them. It was that way when they're out there in the summer, when they lifted, when they ran. And again, they're all good athletes and good players, but they were just committed to that mentality all the time. And I thought this is what made him really unique. And even today, I work with Jacoby now. Jacoby's the same guy now that he was then. He doesn't hit people anymore, but he's still competitive and intense and opinionated And, he wants to run inside zone, whatever. And I know that's when we were out there coaching scout team, that's, he was going to be on it and we were going to be physical. I didn't know anything else was going to happen, but I knew when the ball was snapped that our scout team offensive line was going to come off the ball. And with Ray, it's the same thing, right? We hadn't worked together in 9 years, but I knew exactly what kind of person was going to be out there on the grass that first spring practice. In terms of like the people that you recruit here, it is interesting working at ECU compared to the other places that I've been. I think on paper, people would say that you have access to maybe lesser talent than you do in other places. And this is kind of a side note, but I think there was a time when it was actually easier to keep players in Eastern North Carolina in state because they were harder to find. But with the advent of things like the internet, it's been a little bit tougher to keep secrets hidden out here. It used to be hard to get out to New Bern or to Havelock for coaches who weren't from the state of North Carolina, and it's a little easier now. But yeah, I think finding football players is important. Finding guys who have the right mentality matters. And those are questions that are asked. More than anything else, do they like to practice? Do they like to hit? Do they like football? And I think, though, the major component, to circle back to where we were earlier, is the culture of the institution here, in the same way the culture of Duke was 10 years ago. There is no room for people who won't do things the right way, like they fall into line or they leave or they don't play. And I think, again, it goes back to the vision that the head coach sets and the culture that he creates and that the assistants enforce. And for us, there is a very clear code of what it takes to be good is to be physical and high effort players. And at Duke, there was this similar, maybe not the same values, but the similar way that it was instilled. And so I think really the overarching lesson in coaching for me with that is if everybody's on the same page with what you're trying to do and the kids respond to it, everything else will fall in line. You can find good players. You got to work, you got to coach them, all those things and whatever, but it's mostly about developing them in line with your value system of what you think it means to be successful as a team.
Well, we are at the end of the episode just about. So as anybody who listens knows, I give my guest an open mic, chance to say anything they want about your time at Duke, any stop in your coaching career, your time at ECU now, anything you want to talk about. It's an open mic.
There's not much else to add. We've covered just about everything. Just for anybody out there who's a Duke fan, my wife and I met there. It's a place that we were incredibly fond of. We went over the DPAC for Memorial Day and rolled over to Durham. And it's just for that reason is why I came on this. It's a very special place for us. As we've wandered around the rest of the United States, wearing different shirts, as I like to call it. It's always been home. And it's going to be interesting not having the same staff there now, because that was always a place that I would return to, drive to, stop in at. And obviously I know KJ and the new recruiting guy there, Derek Miller, was here with us this past year. Alan and Kayla also with him too. David Feely was with us at South Carolina back in the day. So I like those guys, but it'd just be a different vibe, so just look forward to getting back at some point and touching base with everybody. I do hope KJ has the success that all y'all want. Very fond of him and just what he taught me, what he allowed me to do. But I was born and raised a Duke fan, and a part of me will always be that way. And obviously, with all that, now that the clock's kind of rolling around towards the season, just excited about what we can do at ECU this year. I kind of, you don't ever want to say it, but it just feels like we got the chance to be a special team. And you got to stay healthy. You got to be lucky. And you got to put in the work, but I think we're headed in the right direction with that here. And it's hard not to think about the good things that happened at Duke when you start to look at your roster and think okay, guys, we got a chance to be all right.
And I think everybody's going to be watching your game against NC State this year. And I know I've got some NC State friends who are very nervous about that game. And I appreciate you coming on. I like to think that people come on here just because this is just the best darn podcast that they're going to find. I think that was implied from your comment.
It is. It's certainly the best Duke related football podcast. It's talked trash to me on Twitter too. So, but no, I do appreciate you having me on. Like, this is a really cool experience to be able to go back through it and talk through some of that stuff. Obviously, something it played a huge part of my life. I'm looking around my office now with my pictures of holding the ACC championship trophy up in the corner and things like that, or I guess the Coastal Division championship trophy up in the corner. And just, I looked a lot younger then, but it was a lot of fun.
Well, part of the reason I'd wanted to have you on, and I was glad that you did, was Jacoby Cofield said so many good things about you when he and I were talking last year, and as we've stayed in touch a little bit since he started back, got into college coaching at ECU. He had spoken very highly of you, and everybody that I've talked to, your name's come up. Everybody's had good things to say about you, and I can see why after spending close to an hour and a half now doing this with you. It's been a very informative talk. I appreciate you taking the time to come on here on a Wednesday night to talk about your career in football, ECU, and of course the Blue Devils. We've got a few more interviews lined up before we go back to the site for the regular season. Follow us at our website, check us out on Twitter, and go Duke.